Welcome to episode 124 of the Necronama.com. I am James Sabata, horror author, screenwriter, co-host of the podcast you're listening to right now. And since you can't see me, I'll just let you know now, I'm wearing my werewolf outfit, and it's very comfortable.
And I'm Don Guillory, author, historian, educator, co-host of this podcast. And I'm more into vampire towns as opposed to werewolf type stuff. But enough about my party days.
Oh, man. All right. So joining us today, Chris Vanderkay is here. Back again. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Thank you so much for having me on again, gentlemen. I appreciate it.
Thanks for coming back.
Absolutely. When you were last here, we covered They Look Like People. And today we have a werewolf film. I feel like there's a theme going on here, man.
Well, it's funny because I didn't realize it. I mean, I knew which movie I came on for last time, but obviously because I guess you could argue the creature was very different, that I assumed that they were far afield from each other. But as it turns out, thematically, these movies are actually pretty close.
They really are. I hadn't overly thought about it till about 5 minutes before we went on here. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Because I wouldn't think, that one's basically things trying to look human, and it seems so counterintuitive, and yet they're basically the same thing.
Yeah. Well, and thematically, obviously, I think because that was a movie about not toxic male behaviors and friendships, I think that's interesting because this one is sort of the flip side of the coin in that respect.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this one's all about what does it mean to be a man, and all these relationships where I have to put up a facade and be something that I'm not, or try to convince somebody that I am. And yeah, that's a great point, man. I love that. So let's back up. Why don't you tell our listeners a bit about yourself?
Yes. So in case you don't remember me from the previous episode, my name is Chris Vanderkay. I'm an author and screenwriter. I used to be a screenwriting professor. Anybody who knows me might know me from the books that I've written. Spoiler alert, which is a book about sort of the, the 25 most trod upon popular genres in Hollywood. We did sort of satires, like templates of how you would write a story like that. I've written a few books about horror and science fiction, primarily from sort of the subgenre perspective. And I'm also occasionally a writer of videos and content from a great website called Council of Zoom. I do a video series over there talking about TV shows and movies that I love, and just, stuff that sometimes gets overlooked that I like sharing. So I was actually excited to come back on here because this is a movie I feel like, while it has gotten some love, it hasn't gotten a huge amount of conversation around it. And I feel it's kind of sad because for my money, it's one of the best werewolf movies I've seen in many years. So I was excited to talk about it.
Yeah, that's definitely how I felt. I'd been putting this off. Like, I hadn't really heard anybody talk about it. And, I watched the trailer and stuff, and I was like, oh, that looks cool to watch one day, but I never got around to it. And then I watched it, and I just fucking loved this. Like, Silver Bullet's always going to be my favorite werewolf movie, but this is definitely way higher on the list than I expected it to be going in.
Yeah, well, and like I was telling you guys off mic, I said, I'm really glad that you ended up responding to it because it has been a recent favorite of mine, and it's always awkward when you suggest something to someone and then sort of go in blind. So I showed up fingers crossed today,
No disappointment at all on my end. And to follow on with James was saying, like, Silver Bullet has always been my favorite. Well, like, that's one that I could probably watch it 3 times in a day. Like, if it happened to be, I'm somewhere and that's the only thing that's on TV and I don't have any choice to watch TV, I'm not going to complain about watching that one. And I will have to definitely say the same thing about this film, where I could probably watch this back to back because I know that I missed some things upon that first viewing, or at least when it came to where my mind was going at certain points, what I was expecting to happen. Or just even the way several of the scenes are shot, which James was texting me before I watched the film, and he said, I love the way it's set up when there are the kills, as far as the stuff that's going on the previous night, and then they juxtapose that with what's taking place. And the only other film I can think about that did did that at the same level was Godfather 2, where Michael Corleone is at the baptism or the christening, and you're seeing all these people get killed. And
oh yeah,
the emotion that he shows in that scene, if it were just the baptism, you wouldn't think anything of it, but it makes you think of what is going through somebody's mind when that tragedy or that violence is taking place, and they possibly know it's there, possibly know it's taking place, or as a viewer, how your impression of that person then changes based off of those juxtaposed scenes, where, one should be about, at least with John, this whole idea that he's dealing with mundane stuff, and then someone's like, hey, yeah, we found another body. Or he's dealing with, just everyday stuff or day-to-day conversations with people, kind of to where he's thinking he's getting some headway, and then all of a sudden there's another body. Or in one case, there are two bodies.
Right. Yeah, I think, well, maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves. Maybe the quick thing to do would be to just sort of say the plot of the movie is about I want to say he's a small town sheriff, but he's actually not sheriff when we meet him. He's sort of a second in command because his dad is sheriff. And sort of the story is about, it's a small town in Utah, and they suddenly start getting a series of very graphic killings that people start thinking might be a werewolf. And it's sort of, we're watching this story through the lens of this guy who's second fiddle to his dad in the sheriff's department, and also dealing with some alcoholism and some family home problems. Right. And the reason I'm glad you brought up that juxtaposition, the sequence where we're seeing, it's hard to describe there's such level of chaos in that moment where we're seeing not only the attack that happened, but we're seeing the day after, the aftermath of them investigating the scene. Yeah, getting in a fight. We're also seeing the funeral where we, the most painful way you can realize that it's not one death, that it's two. It's a slow pan that reveals. But the thing I like the most about that sequence is it swings wildly back and forth emotionally, from horrified to strangely humorous to deeply tragic. And the reason I mentioned the plot of it first is because I think this scene, almost more than any other scene in the movie, perfectly captures what I feel the life of an addict is like, about these wildly shifting emotions and the inability to separate things in your life and give them the appropriate weight and attention, because you're basically watching him sort of crumble in real time, and you see it all sort of crashing together in that one moment. The way that they've cut it is really to, in some ways, just put you into the head of the guy who is struggling and kind of losing the addiction battle because of what's happening around.
Well, and the thing that I love about this scene, because obviously this was the scene I was talking about, but I love also going into the alcoholism, right? Like, you just hit this fucking blur. Like, I was an alcoholic for years, and you just hit a blur where nothing's chronological, nothing's a full scene. Like, when I would try to think, everything was just like puzzle pieces randomly thrown on the floor, right? Mm-hmm. And this hits that so hard for me. But it's also completely cohesive, like you said, of why he's crumbling and what emotions he's feeling. And no matter which emotion it is, they're so off the charts compared to where a healthy human being would be. They're always exaggerated and further gone. And I love how that really shows you have fucking no control at all. Then you add in the symbolism of this being the monster inside of him.
Right.
And this scene is just fucking perfect. And I'm so glad that they didn't go chronologically and show us the kill and then the investigation and then the funeral, because while that would have had weight, it wouldn't have this weight.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's a great point. And I think one of the things that's kind of funny when you think about it, I'm sure we'll get to a point where we spoil the ending, but we're not there yet.
Of course.
But I think a brilliant juxtaposition that they did in this is he is tracking, ostensibly tracking a monster. If we're buying in at the beginning of this film that it's a traditional werewolf story, then we know how a werewolf story works, where a man transforms into something and does horrible things and then basically wakes up unaware of what he's done and has to go and pick up the pieces. And they perfectly created a cross allegory for that with the character of John Marshall, the lead character, who does the exact same thing in his life, but without the excuse of the monster inside, because the monster inside for him is the addiction. And they did such a great job of paralleling those to the degree that, like, I could see someone fully believing that by the end of the movie, it would be revealed that John Marshall was in fact the killer.
And I wouldn't have been disappointed with that. I would have thought that was a cool ending too. I love the ending to this when we get there, but that would have been sweet.
Yeah, and I think we obviously nodded our head in the direction of this at the beginning, but I feel like this movie more than a lot of films I can think of in recent years, in the last few years, is a brilliant exploration of toxic masculinity through the characters being affected by a toxic man. We're actually seeing it through the eyes of a guy whose life is sort of built on toxic masculinity, that is slowly watching it sort of crumble around him and kind of having to figure out in real time how to deal with that and how to not be. And, and I appreciate that the movie doesn't just sort of end with, he got it all figured out and everything's okay. But
right.
he at least there were a few steps in the direction of maybe trying to understand that he's the problem,
No, definitely. I don't know how else to say this, but the exploration of him trying to control his own monster is so fucking perfect with werewolves, because at the end of most werewolf things, unless they're killed, the werewolf goes on. Like, you still have the torture of knowing this could happen again. And I love that they leave him with that.
Well, and in a way, I mean, that's perfect given what the allegory is here, right? Because if we're talking about the violence inherent in toxic men, not all toxic men die at the end when they've done something horrible. They're still in the world, and we still have to deal with them. So although obviously I don't look at John Marshall in the same way that I look at, other monsters that are still with us, but we do look at the idea that the system creates people like this. The patriarchal system creates people like this. So at the end of a movie, it's a bit of a cheat, right? To just be able to simply kill the monster and then everyone's okay.
Oh, absolutely. This is way more true to life.
And by the way, I love the name. His name is John Marshall. It's literally the most cliched tough guy name imaginable. And I also love
Dylan Tucker.
Oh man, don't start that again.
But I like that his name is John Marshall, but he is a sheriff. So he's Sheriff Marshall, or he's not quite sheriff, but he's deputy marshal and wants to become Sheriff Marshall, which I think is kind of a funny in joke.
That is pretty great. I didn't even make that connection. I just didn't pay attention to his name that much, but I love that. So, when we talk about toxic masculinity, and like you said, we usually have like one toxic male who's making life terrible for people. I love how toxic masculinity is just ingrained in society in this film, because that's how it really is. And it's everyone trying to live up to something, but especially John. We're concentrated on John. But, he's trying to prove that he's not the shithead his ex-wife thinks he is. He thinks he's trying to be a good dad. He's trying to meet the expectations his dad has, while also trying to meet the expectations he has for himself in taking care of his dad. And then like that whole fear that I'm not good enough to be sheriff. And he can't choose. He can't go strong enough to prove he can be the new sheriff while still doing what he thinks respects his father. And all of that, while very real, is also consequences of toxic masculinity throughout our lives. It's these roles of I have to be strong and I have to be this. And one of my main moments where I felt he had a bigger change than the film makes out, and we'll get to this, but I feel like it pulls into my conversation here, is when they have to call the ambulance. And he straight says, I can't do this.
Right.
I need you to do it for me. And I thought that's the moment that John Marshall became a man in my eyes, because he was willing to ask for help, knowing that he had to prioritize what's happening. And I think he did everything right in that moment.
Well, and the brilliance of the movie reminds you that he's not good. No matter the fact that he has started to figure it out, of course he's going to continue to fail, because less than 5 minutes later is the moment at which his daughter is attacked by a werewolf. And instead of chasing and trying to stop the werewolf, he starts yelling at his daughter for being out past curfew, as if it's somehow her fault that a werewolf attacked her. In much the way that that patriarchal society tends to blame women for the crimes that are often committed against them,
Well, he makes that comment earlier in the film where he talks about, the way you dress, basically talking about something might happen to her because of the way she, the clothing that she chooses to wear. And
she
even
absolutely doesn't.
Right. And And I started scratching in my head. I'm like, what the fuck is he talking about? I haven't, not that I would say anything is inappropriate, but I can't even see anything that he would, that a normal, quote unquote, father-daughter relationship, I didn't see anything there that would strike me as, oh my gosh, yeah, she's going too far. She shouldn't be wearing that. Or I could see what John is saying. But then as you're watching it, you're thinking two things. Okay, one, people's gaze on her is not her fault. Then you're talking about other people possibly sexualizing your child, which that's, again, not on her. And then three, what the fuck are you talking about with her clothes? Like,
yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things I loved about the energy of that performance there, and also salute to writer, director, producer, actor Jim Cummings for making this film, because that guy is a live wire performance and he's a brilliant filmmaker. But one of the things he does that I think is great is he allows for us to understand where he's coming from without sympathizing with it. And the energy in that sequence reminds me very much of, I'm sure you guys know what I'm talking about. You see those pictures with dads who, answer the door on prom night with a gun when their daughter's dates get there, and the reason for that is very clear. Like, what no one ever wants to admit is the reason that they're terrified that this guy is going to come over and spend time with their daughter is because they know who they are and they know what they would do. And so they fear every other man must be the same way. And so it creates this systemic situation where you want to be what you are, but you're terrified of someone else being that. And so you're going to blame and protect and hide your daughter rather than just, arming her for the world and trusting her and being a decent human being, an example to begin with,
Absolutely. No, and I think that you guys are both hitting this perfectly. Like, as a father with a daughter, I always get that conversation from people like, oh, wait till the boyfriends show up. And I'm like, well, you know what? I could die from a heart attack today, right? So I have to spend her entire life teaching her how to take care of herself. And yes, I'll be there for her. And yes, I'll do whatever, but I trust her. Well, I trust her to make mistakes because we all do, but I also trust her to do what she needs to do. Mm-hmm. And I don't think showing up with a gun is going to help that situation. So I've never understood any of that shit, but it always comes back to me with, well, then what example did you set for her that she thinks a person like that is a great choice?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, if you're not prepping your child for an abusive relationship in that situation, because the only man in her life that has professed love for her showed up at the door with a gun, there's some danger flags you're putting up there.
This is what love means. It means carrying a .40 caliber with you and just holding up in front of somebody's face. But yeah, there is that moment because, like normal, we're going to jump around. But there is that moment when he confronts Chloe about, being out there and the werewolf is out there and getting mad because she's out past curfew. But then we see later there's that scene where he goes to the boyfriend's house and proceeds to beat the shit out of him. And normally we would look at this as like, oh yeah, we know what he was trying to do with his daughter or with that guy's daughter and what was going on. Whereas this one, it's more of an issue of, to go back to the masculinity portion or part of this discussion, that idea that she was with you, even if she was out past curfew, you're supposed to make sure she's safe. And you fucking ran. You left her there to be attacked. So it's a couple of things that I'm picking up on there, which is you could have gotten my kid killed. And then two, you abandoned her. You abandoned her when there was danger. Not excusing him beating the hell out of him, but it's one of those moments where you look at it and you're like, I understand why he is angry, as opposed to, oh, you took my daughter out and you kept her past 11. You kept her out till 11:01 and I'm mad. I'm going to show you what a big man I am. It's the only person I really care about other than my father, was in danger and you left them.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, of course, the irony of that sequence is twofold. One is that it ends so pathetically for him, with him,
Right.
getting maced and having to literally pour like buttermilk into his eyeballs.
God, I love that.
And I love that the sequence ended that way, because it does show his emotional impotence in some way, that he was unable even to deliver this thing that he thought he could do. But I think more importantly, the moments right before he went into the kid's house, he was standing he was in a hospital room where his father is in one bed and his daughter is in another bed. And literally, he has a shotgun in his hands. He's pacing back and forth because he doesn't know how to deal with emotional trauma in his life. So he only knows how, like he only learned how to deal with it the way that a police officer would deal with it, which is to go find the culprit and to take them down. He didn't understand that where he was needed was in that room. And it really hits home, because after he shows back up with buttermilk stained hair and throbbing eyes to see his daughter, his father passed away while he was gone. And nothing is more emblematic of the fact that you put your energy in the wrong place than that you took off for 15 minutes to beat up your daughter's boyfriend. And in that time, you lost your father, who you cared so much about all this time.
Right.
And that scene is so great because, okay, this is one of the things I love about the film overall. So I'm going to give you two examples of this, but this scene in particular is one of them. She just looks at him and says, "Dad, where were you?" She doesn't say, "Grandpa's dead, dude. Like, look over at that bed." Like, she doesn't do that. She just, "Where were you?" And he tries to speak and she goes, "No." And then she kind of looks over there, right?
Yeah.
That has so much more.
She literally just says, "No, Dad." She doesn't even say anything else. It's just, "No, Dad." And then we rack focus from behind him to notice that he walked in the room and didn't even notice his father wasn't in there.
Mm-hmm.
And it's those moments, because so many films go out of their way to over-explain the moment. And this carries so much more weight because of that. And the other scene that's like that is when the guy barges into, I think it's the cafeteria, and he's yelling for John. And he doesn't say there's another body. He doesn't say there's been another horrific murder and this happened. They just like stare at each other. And John's like, "Oh." And that's one of the strongest points to this movie for me, is there's so much said without people saying stuff. And that's how real life works. And that emotional impact of both of those scenes is so much stronger to me. Like, I wouldn't remember this scene in the cafeteria if he ran in and was like, "It's been another murder. We got to get down to this corner." You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the brilliant things about the movies, it does both. It does that, and it also does sort of the exact opposite, which is that there are characters who talk so much and are entirely unaware of what they're accidentally revealing to the world.
Yes.
Like, I think one of the best moments is right after the first murder, when John is walking away and he says, "I got to call Jenna," and then his partner, Officer Robson, says, why do you have to call Jenna?" And he goes, "I didn't say that. Did I say that?" Like, he doesn't even realize that his surface level emotion is literally just spilling out verbally, and he's not even aware that it's happening because he's so not in control of his emotional state, Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, but that's what's great about it, is different characters do it differently, and John in different places does it differently. It's such a tight grasp on this master dialogue in this.
Yeah, for sure. It's this movie is it's almost as if somebody like Aaron Sorkin or David Mamet wrote the sequences where the cops are on the scene, because it's the rhythm of it is so quick and brilliant, and it's literally almost like the most graphic Three Stooges scene ever imagined. In the sequence where the one guy is saying, "Oh, maybe it was he was a hunter without a license," and then he goes over and he kneels next to the body and goes, "You know what? Can you come over here next to the corpse and tell me that you think that this was just a hunter without a license?"
It was a hunter without a license.
He goes, "You know what? You should have gone to school for mathematics because you're a terrible police officer." Yeah, and I mean, I also think one of the things that we can't not note, given that the entire thrust of the film is about a police department trying to solve a crime, is this movie, while it does it mostly comedically, does really point out the problem with incompetent and incapable men having positions of too much power for the level of responsibility that they have. And I think the best way that it's exemplified is not only the big blustery scenes we're talking about with the police officers and them butting heads, but it's throughout the entire film, the secret MVP of this movie is Ricky Lindholm as Officer Robson, because every single time she's on screen, she's quietly solving a problem or putting out a fire that somebody else created. And she's so effortlessly good at her job that there's one wordless moment where you see Robert Forster recognize that his son should not be the one in charge and that she should. And it's right before he's actually dismissed from his job, before he, I guess, quote unquote, retires and goes to the hospital. But he sees it in real time. He recognizes she's been here quietly doing everything that someone in my position should. And the rest of us have been sort of blundering about, yelling at each other and getting mad that we don't have a solution, while she's basically the one that does all of the work. Her and like you said, the older woman that works at the front desk that not only called to get him help, but then also later was the one that went and moved his car after he, drunkenly parked in the middle of the street.
Did you know you're parked in the middle of the street? I love that line. She just says it so calmly.
Yeah, and the brilliant thing about that is that if John is getting anything accomplished in this life, and I'm not sure that he is, but the only reason that John can function is because of the two women in the department who are quietly caring for him.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, they're always batting cleanup for him constantly. Yeah. There's another great scene with Lindholm where they're in the car and John's going off and he says something like, do you think this is how women have been treated since the Middle Ages? And her look says just volumes of novels of things to him in that one look. It's so good.
Well, it's interesting because one of the things they did in this movie that I thought was remarkably clever was they the first pass that you watch this movie, you're watching because you're watching victims of this monster. But what you realize when you go back, because I think I've watched this 3 or 4 times now, what you realize when you go back is that each one of the women knew that they were in danger, not from the monster, but because of some other encounter that they had with a human being at some point, a human man that scared them, that made them worried about their safety. And we get to see one of those sequences in the diner, but we get an insinuation of one with the ski instructor. She's inside, and it's a wordless moment where we see her talking to friends, and then she just looks up and we see the fear on her face. We don't see who it is she's fearful of, but we see the fear. And I think kind of the brilliant thing about that moment that you're talking about with John, realizing for 1 second, women have been dealing with this forever, is that, everybody else in this movie, the victims, the women, expected something like this could happen. They unfortunately still fell victim to it, but they were paying attention. It's the men that are shocked in this movie that something like this could be, that something like this could happen to someone in their town, that it could happen to a woman. But the women are not only fully aware of it, but like worried about it and sometimes preparing for it,
Yeah, because even the ski instructor's friend is trying to point out red flags about this guy that she's going on a date with. And I mean, so even there you have women taking care of each other. It's just an ongoing thing throughout this, that the women are always caring for people and always looking for the red flags.
Yeah. And there's an interesting thing with John's monologue about, that through history, we've been blaming monsters for men's crimes. We say a woman was found killed and it was so brutal that they assume it couldn't have been a human, so it must be a werewolf or something. It made me think, how people frequently talk about how serial killers are, I don't know what you say, not an invention of, but like something that came about sort of with the Industrial Revolution moving forward. And I've had a theory for a long time that serial killers have been with us forever. The difference is that we have only recently started to care about the people that serial killers would be hunting down. And that's the only reason that we've noticed. Because in the Wild West, no one would consider a cowboy who killed a bunch of Native Americans a serial killer. Or, in the plantation era South, if you could have killed 30 black people and no one would have cared because it was, it was the era of slavery. So I feel like the inherent possibility of brutal white men that want to dominate and kill other people has been around forever. We've only been calling it serial killing because there was a point at which doing that no longer was socially acceptable. So now it's a crime.
I like that.
And I think this movie kind of taps into that idea, the idea of the, aggrieved white man taking it out on people who are not really responsible for it. One of the things that, I won't go into that yet because we don't want to get into spoiler territory just yet. I don't know. But I think
we can get there whenever you want to.
Yeah,
okay.
There's no way.
All right. Well, so we'll just go ahead and dive into it then. I guess we could say the ultimate revelation is that there both is and is not a werewolf, in the sense that they do find who the killer is. He's a man that lives locally, is a taxidermist, and that's one of the things that gives him away. But the bigger revelation is that because he's a taxidermist, he has fashioned himself a werewolf suit that he wears. He's like, what is he, like 6'5" tall or something like that, the guy. And so he puts this costume on to go out, and essentially what it seems like they're hinting at is that he's getting revenge for women that have rejected him or wronged him, or just are not within his ability to woo or be with. We know for sure that was him at the diner. So he was talking to the woman, and she recognized that he was a creep and sort of was going to tell somebody. So he took off. We get the insinuation later that he was probably the guy that she was the ski instructor was staring at, that was scared of. And so what we discover is that the quote unquote monster is a man who's putting on the disguise to go and take revenge on women who he feels like must have rejected him. You
see that at least, I would say, more than just within recent history. You see this. Gosh, there's no limit to how many stories have been about men responding violently towards women, because they were rejected, or they felt they were being ridiculed, or they just felt like they were entitled to that woman's body or time. And even if we're looking at, whether it happens to be incels or people who are starting to push this idea of, which I hate this term, traditional male-female roles within society. You have men that start to, and some women support this, that will excuse violence that takes place against women because of the way that the women are conducting themselves publicly. We've got a bunch of examples, and one that comes to mind right now is there's this great interaction between Elliot Stabler and a sex worker on Law and Order. And so she talks about being assaulted, and she makes this comment that said, I was scared to go to the police because I know that you wouldn't treat this seriously because of what I do for a living. And he responds back and says, it doesn't matter what you do for a living. No one deserves to be raped. No one deserves to be sexually assaulted. And she's obviously responding to something that she's expecting to hear from him, which is something that she's heard from so many other people, which is because of the way that you live your life and because of the role that you have in life, because of the profession that you take up, you should be violated by men, or you should be ridiculed by men. You should, whatever the stupid excuse that they give for an attack on a woman's body. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that I think there's a fantastic example of the way in which women are unfortunately burdened with having to be the defender of their own situation, rather than being able to just report a person who's a problem, right? There's in the scene in the diner, there's such a brilliant moment where he comes in and sits down and starts asking her questions and says something about the elementary school that that she used to go to or something like that. And then she does this thing, which I think it's fantastic, and she's brilliant, but it's tragic that these kinds of things have to happen, which is he says something about, are you going to send your daughter to that elementary school? And she says, yes, my husband and I will. And the reason she does that is because she's trying to give him a polite out to stop doing this. And what's sad to me is that she feels like she had to do that, and she had to do that politely because she understands in this world that if an aggrieved man decides he wants to be a monster, there's little that she can do about it until it actually happens.
Right.
And so you see the reaction, the way that she's had to change her behavior. What should happen is she should be able to say, please stop talking to me. You're being a creep. That should be allowed. You should be allowed to say that. But because of the world we live in, because of the patriarchal society, people will treat her like she was wronged there because all he was doing was being friendly and having a conversation, So she's had to find a way to navigate putting information into a conversation that should hopefully cause him to leave or at least be discouraged without in any way seeming discouraging. It's like she has to consider his feelings for some fucking reason. And honestly, it's understandable because this guy ends up being the monster that indeed does end up killing her and her child.
And that's one of those things that unfortunately we're teaching, or have been teaching. Hopefully people have stopped doing that, but have been teaching young girls how to respond to boys, as opposed to teaching young boys who will then become men that they shouldn't conduct themselves in a certain way, which is, I remember when I was growing up, the stupid thing that was taught was, and if you agree with this, I mean, I'm sorry, but it's stupid, was, if a boy hits you, it means he likes you. Or if he's mean to you, it means that he likes you. if this boy asks you out, and you don't want to go, and this was something I used to, when I was in person, I would teach my students, like in the 50s, or at least 50s and 60s, one of the excuses that girls would give for not going out with a guy was, oh, I have to babysit. And that becomes that out, just like saying, oh, my husband and I are sending our child to, we're sending the kid to that school. It's, oh, I'm babysitting. So then it's like, well, I can't really, confront her about that, as opposed to if she just says no, then I can just harass her, bother her until she gives in, which is another one of those stupid things that was taught to men, which was no doesn't mean no. No means try harder. Right. Which again, what we've got to start doing, and hopefully some people have already started doing this in their own homes, is unteaching that nonsense, which is, guys should be held accountable for shitty behavior.
Yeah, well, I mean, and like you said, the problem has been that we frequently try to tell women how to defend themselves instead of telling men how to act to begin with, so that women don't have to defend.
Yeah, like those products. I just saw it the other day. It was an anti drink spiking cover. It's just something that women could put over their drinks to prevent men from drugging them, as opposed to what we should be teaching people, which is maybe you shouldn't be fucking drugging people. But I mean, that's the world we live in, where women have to defend themselves in every situation, every possible situation that could come up, because as the two of you were talking about this idea of the women were in less shock of the attack as men were. It's because you're always having to deal with shitty people or uncomfortable situations.
Yeah. Well, and it should be at least acknowledged, because it's three dudes sitting here talking about this. I think one of the great things that happens in the movie is, I think that the Jim Cummings, as a writer, director, and lead, make sure not to let anyone off the hook in the conversation here, because one of the things that, even as we're watching John learn what the problem is, which is the problem is angry men who think that they're allowed to just do whatever they want to women, he's the one that posits that theory. But he's also the one who, in the first AA meeting, says that he fantasizes sometimes about turning on a tractor and letting it drive through his ex-wife's house. Right. So he is as much the problem as he is the person who is learning what the problem is. And I think one of the things I like about that is that it one of the things you'll frequently find is people who can speak a good game as an ally, but when the rubber hits the road, they're not where they should be, or they're not, right. They're not recognizing that they're part of the problem. Maybe not the biggest part of the problem, but still part of the problem. And Absolutely. I think there's one really telling moment at the very end of the film, spoiler alert, they get the guy, everybody is still alive except for the villain for the most part. And he has just dropped his daughter off at college. There's this sweet moment where he leaves some protection in her drawer, and she sees the first protection, which is the condoms, and smiles. And then we see the reaction to her face, which means there's some other protection in that drawer that may not be of the prophylactic kind. But then there's a final moment where he's walking down the stairs to leave the college. And as he's walking, he overhears a couple of guys talking about the new gymnastics team. And one of the guys says, "Yay, fresh meat." And for just a second, you see John stop. And then he keeps walking. And I think that's a powerful moment, because it means two things. It means, one, he's gotten better in that he didn't just grab that guy and start smashing his head into the pavement like he probably would have earlier in the film. But in some ways, it's also a final indictment of the fact that even after everything that he's seen and learned about men and their views of women, he couldn't find a constructive, socially appropriate way to tell those guys that that's not right. Right. He went from being violent towards men because he's afraid of what they're going to do to his daughter to just letting it go. And that's not necessarily the better solution. Yes, his daughter should be able to protect herself, and it shouldn't be just about him protecting his daughter. But could he have not said something as a man in a position of power to be able to point out to these guys that that's not the way that you think about and talk about women, And
that's part of that Arrested Development that you see with him and with a lot of men, right? Yep. Which, I'll even say I will tell on myself, as far as, like, I'm not one of those people that's fully gotten past that, because there are those moments when I saw that scene, my first thought was like, oh, then to them, please. And it wasn't, oh, have a conversation with them. I immediately went into my head, and my wife kind of looked at me because she knew what I was thinking. I was just like, what the fuck is wrong with you guys? Because for me, it wasn't even, oh, this is my daughter these guys are talking about. I mean, is this daughter? I mean, as far as the line that they use to let you know that he's possibly thinking about his daughter. But the idea that more men need to be willing to step up and stand up to when other douche bros happen to say stuff like that. Hey, fresh meat. Like, no, fucker. Like, no. Right. There should be a constructive way to actually engage with those young men that goes beyond my desire to, pull them aside and have a conversation that's not going to involve words.
Right, exactly. there has to be another step beyond punch. And I kind of like the ending is saying there's still work to be done, but at least he's past the punching,
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. No, it's true. I think it's a powerful movie because it's a film about baby steps taken by someone who was a problem to try and recognize that he's part of the problem. Not necessarily to solve the problem yet, but I think the thing I liked about the movie is that while he defeated the single monster that they were up against in this situation, that's also a moment where he recognizes that it's not an isolated thing, that there are a lot of monsters out there,
Oh, definitely.
Well, and it goes back to the werewolf symbolism, because in this moment, he controls the monster. Like, that monster reacts. He's got that urge to flip around and beat the shit out of him, like he said, but in that single moment, he controlled it. That doesn't mean he'll control it the next time somebody says some shit about his daughter. Doesn't mean that he can control it every day, Like, and I think that plays into the AA stuff. Like he's been through AA, done the 12 steps, and he's been at the crest of maintaining and lost it. So like, I feel like this ending works really well with that. So as much as I'd like him to have the nicer talk, like, I think that this personifies exactly who he is and everything this movie has been.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and also, I mean, they showed us for the first half of the film before Robert Forster's character leaves the story. We see perfectly why the road has been paved for him to be the way that he is. We're looking at a man, his dad, who's still the sheriff of the department, though it's clear through every interaction we see with him and his son that he should have already been retired. He has some serious health issues, perhaps some mental issues that come from the anxiety he's having with his health. He should not be in charge. And yet the level of pride he has, he keeps talking about this thing that happened 40 years ago, with them getting getting someone to break and he's not only living in the past, but he's sort of living on the fumes of the pride that he had from his previous life, and he's unable to let go. So in some ways, the fact that we know his mom left, they mentioned that briefly, and that this is the male example in his life, it's certainly not by any means a forgiveness, but it helps you to understand what it is that he's up against, that he's trying to get over, that he's trying to stop being like, Mm-hmm. And I think that's not the only reason, but I think it's the most powerful reason for why Robert Forster's character is in the story, because what he represents is he represents the patriarchal society in some ways. He represents the system that we've all been a part of, and that unfortunately a lot of people feel trapped inside of because they don't think that it should be any different, or they just don't know any differently,
Well, and even it shows how the cycle perpetuates itself. Because, as a child, once mom was out of the picture, no matter how old he was, dad was gone all the time, always at work. So you follow in his footsteps and you get to spend time with him that way, right? And then he's doing the same thing to his daughter. He's not actively in her life, even when she lives with him. And I thought that was a really good way to show how this shit just regurgitates itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it just perpetuates over and over. Yeah, exactly. Like we said earlier, when the girl sees her father brandish a gun and thinks that that's what love means, then, in some way you play out what you've seen as a child, in your adult life, unless something intervenes, And I think it's interesting because, I don't think everybody should have to deal with a man dressing up as a werewolf in order to have that intervention. But in this case, it seems like it's weirdly the thing that ended up helping John to understand his role in life, the level of power that he exerts over people and what that means and how he.
And that's why I'm wearing my werewolf costume right now, just to help any of you who need some help.
And, it's funny that you said that, but I just, one of the things that I think is kind of like a brilliantly pragmatic solution in this movie is that the fact that it is in fact not a werewolf, but a man in a costume is such a brilliant pragmatic decision, because it means that you can just show a guy in a werewolf costume. And if at any point in time someone watching it was like, I don't know if that looks that much like a werewolf, the ultimate reveal at the end is, guess what? It's not a werewolf. It's a dude in a werewolf costume. So your complaint was bullshit.
Well, let me just say, to me, the werewolf looked great.
Oh, it was fantastic. I loved it.
And more films should take lessons from this. But I love how they use this costume to fuck with the audience, because it does take that doubt out. Like without the shots of the wolf, and I mean, I read spoilers going in, I knew what was going on, but without that, I feel like you'd be more likely to believe there's a wolf, right? Like, and then there is, like, there's, it's totally fair. There was a wolf, and it makes perfect sense. And then on top of it, it serves such great symbolic value. Like, it's literally a guy showing the monster inside, whereas everyone else in town, we all deal with a monster inside of us at some point, right? And no one else gets the physical representation. So I like that this killer gets it.
Yeah. Well, and also, I mean, how many times have we seen someone who will, say affluent white men frequently find someone other than themselves to blame for whatever horrible thing has happened, This reminds me of sort of, that excuse of affluenza, rich people that are beyond the idea of standard morality because they were raised by rich people and never had to face a problem in their lives. Like I look at this and I think this is this guy removing himself from responsibility by saying that it's this thing that's doing it. Even though he is creating the thing, he's still, in the same way that people will, say that, I saw my, I thought my wife was cheating on me. And so, that's why I hit her. That's why I shot her, whatever. In some way, still trying to find a way to put the blame on the other party in the situation,
Definitely.
And I feel like the costume of the werewolf is doing a similar thing. It's basically externalizing something. So it's not their fault anymore, And I think that's also one of the reasons why John, in some ways, recognizes, everybody's saying that it's a werewolf. And for a while, it seems like it's a werewolf. But John is always firmly, remember, there's literally a line where he goes, wait, when am I going to be able to be right sometimes? It is not a werewolf. It's just a man. And that line is funny. But later in the movie, I think what it comes to mean, at least to me, is that the reason that John inherently believes that it's a man and not something else is not necessarily because he's a supernatural skeptic. It's because he understands that part of himself. Whether he's consciously aware of it or not, absolutely is not that far away from him. The idea that he would drive a tractor through his wife's house means he's never too far away from unreasonable violence meted out for bad reasons,
Yeah, and even being a police officer, like if this was normal townspeople saying, oh, it's a wolf, I get it. But from John's point of view, like, you guys are cops. Like, we see shit all the time. Maybe not on this level, obviously, but like we see a lot of shit. We know the bad that's in people. And I feel like that's why he can't grasp that they're yelling about werewolves, and that's why he's so frustrated with it. I think if it was just normal townspeople, he'd be like, no, Debbie, it's a man, and that'd be it.
Yeah. Well, and I think it reflects nicely on what eventually ends up happening at the end of the story, which is because there's an inherent level of violence inside of him that is also inside of the bad guy. He was almost killed by this guy. And then in the end, what ends up happening, there's some fireworks that explode above him. And then Julia Robson shoots the bad guy in the back. He collapses. He's on the ground, unable to go. That could be done. Julia did the job with the least amount of violence necessary to stop him. And then what happened? John stood up and turned around and emptied his gun into the man's face, just like the boyfriend whose soon-to-be fiance was killed at the beginning asked him to. They said, keep shooting him until you can see the ground through his face, I think was the line.
Yes. Yes. I love that line.
It was a great line. But then when you think about it, like, you think that there's this inherent violence in all of the men in this movie that's almost systemically built around them. Julia did her job, which was to stop the man, but John was the one that killed the man. And I think that's an interesting distinction.
Well, and the boyfriend you bring up, Jimmy Tatro, is the actor. He's one of my favorite actors. I'm a huge fan of American Vandal. If you haven't seen it, check it out. I won't tell you anything else about it, though. But
hashtag who did the dicks, right?
Yes. No, I love this mockumentary, and it started me with a fascination with him. My wife watches Modern Family. He's been on there. I love him on there. Like, everything I've seen this guy in has been great. And this role for him was just stupendous. I mean, he's so perfect at it, because he can exude the anger, the shoot him until you can see the ground through his face, and you believe it. But at the same time that he's saying that, you see his full vulnerability, knowing that he can't do shit. Mm-hmm. He's just stuck there.
Yeah.
And then he's also, that's kind of a mirror for John at the same time. Like, John sees his anger and he sees that vulnerability. And I don't know that John's making this connection, but it's clearly there, and it resonates with him to the point that he does it at the end.
Yeah. Well, in a way, I mean, one of the things I think that's interesting about Tatra's character is he has something that John doesn't, and John is literally staring at him in bafflement, which is he starts crying in the moment about having lost his girlfriend, and then his mom comes over and holds him. And you can see on John's face, it's a level of like jealousy and not understanding and so many confusing factors running through him that I think in some ways that is why he ended up shooting him at the end, just because like that kid who was maybe more emotionally available to just be able to cry and hold his mom than John ever was at any point in time in the story, or perhaps any point in his life, that guy said that, and that's why it registered with him to do it, because he was like, that's a male example, and what that guy said meant something to me. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I just want to point it out because it only comes up in a couple of places in the movie. It's a very small subplot. I've heard some people say was completely superfluous, which is that we keep cutting to shots of a drug addict of some kind living in a like a little trailer out in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
Right. And I like that story that's fit in there. Eventually what happens is we think he ends up dying from an overdose. They find the body and assume that he's the bad guy because he has a werewolf tattoo and because he's the right height and whatever it is. But I think it's interesting for a couple of reasons. It's not a main part of the story, and the character doesn't tie in any way. And I actually think it's important because it seems like what they're kind of talking about there is it feeds into the overall theme, which is that affluent white men get away with horrible crimes against women, and then we generally blame it on people who are struggling with addiction and other problems, and we scapegoat them as the likely the cause of it. And I thought that was an interesting observation in a movie that otherwise didn't need those scenes to forward the story,
Yeah, no, totally. And again, it's another person trying to control their monster inside. I mean, in this case, obviously he loses, but
yeah.
So you get that as well, but told in a similar but different way. He's doing drugs and everything else. But I just want to say, I was so glad that he wasn't a person of color, because if you told me, like you just told me what was happening in this, I would just assume that Hollywood made him a person of color for this, and that he's the one that gets blamed and he gets this. I love that he's a white guy, like you said, and that he's not. He's the kind of white guy we blame when we don't have anyone else as a society.
Yeah, and, I think it was an interesting choice that really the only diverse characters in this story are actually the cops. There's a Hispanic cop and a black cop. Everybody else is bone white. But yeah, the only diverse characters that happen to be police officers, unfortunately, one of which meets his fate in a trash can in a really disturbing scene. We only see the aftermath. We don't see what happened to him. We just sort of get a general idea of what might have happened to him because of the aftermath. But
I mean, at least the wolf cleans up after himself, right?
But sometimes.
He was fresh the other times. He only had time to take certain body parts.
Yeah. I have to tell you, one of the things I thought was funny, I'm a huge fan of Jim Cummings, mostly because of this movie. I went and watched a lot of his other films. But one of the reasons I went and watched other films and went and looked up pictures of him is because I needed to know if those were his real canine teeth. Because I'm not crazy. It was as if they were trying to leave breadcrumb clues that this is clearly an allegory, and he's the werewolf, even if he's not the actual bad guy. I see those teeth, and then I see like there's moments where his daughter is sleeping and it's a POV camera moving towards her, and then they cut and he's sort of like hunched over her. Like they keep dropping these visual illusions that he is his own monster, he is his own werewolf. And I couldn't find any evidence that he capped his teeth or anything, but I just thought his teeth are too perfect and just too pointy. And the way that they frame it so that they look like fangs is just...
No, I swear the teeth are like lit up. Like they come out more than they should. And I feel it's very purposeful.
He did 5 pressed really white strips before every scene, probably.
And then they still filtered it. No. But no, I loved that. I thought that was a great addition, and I'm glad you brought it up. It was in my notes to bring up later, but yeah, great.
Yeah, there's one of the things I think is funniest about this movie, and both sad and funny, is the way that it uses its allegory and symbolism sometimes for humorous effect. I think the fact that the AA meetings are in the basement below the police station is a brilliant allegory for him burying his problems underneath his job. There's so many fun things that point that out. Or even like throwaway lines that end up meaning much more than you think it did. Like when you hear John and his dad when they're giving a statement to the newspaper people, and then you hear John quickly say to one of the newspaper people, "See you in the basement on Sunday." It sounds like he's possibly threatening this guy with like outing him as another member of the AA group if he doesn't give them a good write-up in the paper.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's so funny because like you see that numerous times, even sometimes simple ones. But like when Robson is trying to convince the kid not to put the sign up, the sign that says something about the Wolfman of Snow Hollow. And the way that she does it is by noting that his license plate is expired. There's all this sort of like soft pressure by police officers to other people to keep them in line. And I thought that was actually kind of a clever undercurrent throughout the whole thing of the way that they're, sort of peddling influence,
I almost think I would have liked it better if it was one of the other police. Like it felt a little out of character for me.
Yeah, you know what? You're not wrong. I think it was, if it had been the only reason I think it does make sense for her is because unlike him, where he's threatening a man's livelihood, I mean, what's the worst that would happen with an expired plate? You got to pay a couple $100 and she probably wasn't even going to do it. But this is just another example of her finding a way without screaming and violence to solve the problem, much like she has for the rest of the film, and which John's character can't get his head around. Like he only knows how to punch things, he only knows how to threaten the coroner by smacking him in the face, or he only knows how to drag his coworker off and shove him down in the snow and, start punching him. And like, that's how he deals with all of his problems. Whereas in the background of this whole movie, Officer Julia Robson is slowly and methodically solving everything that needs to be solved in order to crack this case.
I withdraw my complaint. You've convinced me. I like that a lot. I got to know, like when he threatens the coroner and he's like, your daughter's going to get made fun of at school because her dad just got fired. I'm like, is that a thing? I never had people make fun of me for that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've been made fun of for a lot of things, but not that.
I was like, you're really bad at insults.
I do love, though, that the throwaway moment of someone just smashing a beer bottle on the side of the car ended up paying off in a very interesting way that I never expected later in the movie.
Yeah, that's pretty great.
Yeah. And so, and the other thing, the last thing I would note about Officer Robson that I thought was a really nice touch was at the end, we find out that she is, in fact, the sheriff now, that he either steps down or everyone recognized that she was just going to be a better sheriff. So I liked that. But even in the midst of her success and her promotion, there's still a moment that reminds us this is a fluke, because when she goes to put her sheriff's hat on, she had to cut a hole in the back. And she says they don't make them for ponytails. And like that tells us everything we need to know about a system that is built without ever taking into consideration that a woman might be the person holding that position, Right. And I thought that was a really powerful way to do it without overplaying your hand. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. Is there anything at the end that says he's still a police officer?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. Well, the one thing I think he still had his gun, because the insinuation is he left his service revolver in the drawer for her, because when he comes outside, you see him still buckling his belt. Mm-hmm. So he must have just taken it off. Yeah. So I don't know. Normally when you are no longer a police officer, I think, well, I don't know. I'm going up based on cop movies where the chief asks for your gun and your badge, but I don't know. I don't know if that's his gun or if that was a service revolver. Regardless, he's going to be in trouble. Either he lost his job or he gave away a service revolver. Either way, that doesn't reflect super well on his job's future.
I don't know. The new sheriff might be like, yeah, that's a good place for it.
As opposed to him having it, that's probably better.
I was having this moment, though, where I was scared that they were going to get together at the end because, she's visiting the daughter and then he's there. And I'm like, please don't fucking do that. Like, just
because it's overdone and it's not necessary.
Well, and not only that, but I think they did a good job.
Somebody better.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. Like, even if he had attempted it, she would have shot it down politely, doing the same thing that the woman in the diner did, finding a safe way to tell him no. But there was a moment when they were sitting on the road talking where it seemed like that too, where she reached over and put her hand on his hand or leg or something. And for just a second, I was really nervous until I realized that it was just, this movie was smarter than that. And this was just a friend trying to help her friend get out of a hole that he dug himself,
Yeah. No, I'm so glad, because I think it would have really devalued things if she suddenly needed a man in her life. You know what I mean? So,
well, especially that one.
Yeah, exactly. But no, I do love that she makes the shot on the werewolf, like you said, because this once again brings us back to how the women are always protecting everybody in this story. But it also doesn't feel forced. Like if it was a guy doing it, I would feel the exact same way about it, right? Like it's so well done that it's not a woman saving him. It's just another cop taking the shot to save you.
Yeah.
Right. And well, I thought that was really well balanced.
Yeah, and it's not a deus ex machina because she spent the whole film investigating it. Like the only person we see do any actual police work on this case is her. You know, she's the one looking over the case while she's eating dinner at home. She's the one that brings the pictures out. She's the one that was going through all the evidence, that got the phone call from the guy, and she's the one that sort of connected all of that. He sort of stumbled ass backwards into, you know, accidentally going to the house of the person who did it, you know.
And then he still makes terrible mistakes by coming back into the house.
Well, not only that, it's like, hey, could you stand all the way up for me? And at that moment, I was like, you.
Well, but honestly, I think the brilliance of this movie is that it never allows him a full hero moment because he's never really a full hero. You know,
no.
Even in the midst of maybe figuring something out that was a little bit of astute detective work, because he remembered that earlier in the movie, this guy said he had a wife and now he says he doesn't. So he thinks, oh, he's hiding something. But even in the midst of that, he still makes stupid mistakes. And I really appreciate the movie for that, for like recognizing that he's trying, but he's not going to solve it this quickly. Just because he knows there's an issue doesn't mean it suddenly goes away, you know?
Yep. Well, and I do like the one thing I truly love about this part, when he says, would you stand up to your full height? The way he stands up is so obviously, purposely reminiscent of a werewolf transformation. Mm-hmm. Like you get like the elongating muscles and, you know, growing in size, and I don't know. It's a great shot.
Yeah. And I tip my hat to, I can't remember her name now, but the cinematographer of this movie deserves all the awards because this was a beautifully photographed film. Yeah. But like, I give her particular credit for that shot because the way that she framed it, or the way she framed that entire sequence, he seemed like a kind of a tall guy, but the way she framed that, he was suddenly a giant. He was a towering monster. And the way that she framed it was such that when he stood at his full height, he hit the door jamb in the corner and extended above it so that you could literally see his face sort of above where the door was. So even though he probably was, 6'5" or something, the way that she shot it made it work so well. And it was one unbroken take of him standing up, and it was just so super effective.
Yeah, it looks amazing. But I loved that it's the reveal of the monster, like it's so great to do it that way.
Yeah, I think that's, as I'm thinking back, I mean, obviously I could talk about this movie for another 4 hours, but I think those were most of the the big takeaways for me, as far as I was just really taken with a movie that seemed like it could have been, like from its framework, could have been a B programmer from the 1970s, about a small Utah town besieged by a werewolf, and that it had so much to say. And that it could simultaneously not only say all of that stuff, but also be as funny and compelling as it was scary, because I wouldn't think to call this movie necessarily a horror comedy, even though it absolutely is, because I laughed a lot, but it was never a film that was funny outside of the characters' genuine reactions to circumstances. You know what I mean? The comedy was so grounded in the problematic characters that it never felt like a horror comedy in the sort of Evil Dead 2.
Oh, definitely. Like one of the funniest scenes to me is when he's yelling at Ricky at the AA meeting. And that should not be a funny scene. Like on paper, that's not funny. But the delivery and the juxtaposition of the seriousness of the situation and why he's so fucked up at this point and everything else. And then he's just yelling at Ricky. Oh my God, I laughed so hard at this scene.
No, the AA meetings are full of jokes that are entirely based on juxtaposition. I think one of the funniest ones is he just finishes saying that thing about, sending a tractor through his wife's house, not because he wants to hurt anybody, but just because he wants someone to notice that he's alive. And then there's about a 2-second pause. And then he says, Ricky brought oatmeal cookies. And I lost it because the way that he shifts from such wide, like the pendulum swing of emotion going on in those moments is so fantastically played by Jim Cummings that you could go from a confession about how you'd like to destroy your wife's life to don't forget to help yourself to the cookies on the table. It's such a fantastic move.
All right, so I think that wraps it up for talking about the film. So let's move into movie recommendations.
Sure. I'm sort of tied with two films that seem most appropriate. The first one is obvious. It's actually Thunder Road, the other film by Jim Cummings.
Nice.
It was a Sundance hit. And the reason I recommend it is because it's literally this movie without a werewolf. It's just the personal problems of an alcoholic police officer struggling to take care of his child, and that he just lost one of his parents and is sort of coming apart at the seams. And so in some ways I think it's fun to watch it because I'm a huge genre buff, but I also think this story works just as well as I don't even know what you would call it, like a weird indie drama comedy that it defies all possibility that it would be as emotionally affecting as it is, but it really is. So that's the first one, and for obvious reasons. And then the second one is another film in which they take a tried and true monster, and through the tropes of that monster, explore the idea of toxic masculinity and men's tendency to mete out violence towards women. And that's George Romero's Martin.
Ooh, nice.
It's a fantastic story about a kid who believes that he's a vampire, and that the movie never really commits to saying one way or another for sure if he is or he isn't. But because of his belief that he is, he has this sort of black and white fantasy life of the interactions he has with women when he feeds on them, versus the horrifying reality is that he's basically just sexually assaulting and probably murdering women with a straight razor. But it really gets inside the head of a problematic young man who doesn't understand the sort of origins of his own violence and is blaming it on, or having other people blame it on things that aren't really the root of the problem, And I think in many ways these would make a fascinating double pairing, maybe watching Martin first and then following it up with The Wolf of Snow Hollow.
Love it. All right. So I actually have two double features today, Don. So I got to go Werewolves Within for my double feature because they're very closely tied while being very different movies. And I know you watched both of them this weekend, so if you want to talk about that in a second, I'd love to hear your thoughts. But the way that they're a mystery with werewolves, with comedy and horror, and I just feel like these two go really well together. And then I can't talk werewolves without Silver Bullet, so I have to say Silver Bullet as well because it's my favorite werewolf movie.
I now have to cop to saying that I haven't seen Silver Bullet in over a decade. So I clearly, with the love in the room for that, I'm going to have to go back and watch that movie again.
And once you do, check out our episode on Silver Bullet. All right, Don, you're up.
All right. Well, I'm going to go with another classic, which would be Monster Squad, because even the werewolf that's in that film has that struggle of, having to deal with that, deal with his identity. Since we talked about toxic masculinity a good bit, and you mentioned Werewolves Within, got to mention Scare Me by Josh Rubin. We Summon the Darkness, The Howling, Cabin in the Woods, American Werewolf in London. Strangely enough, I had this feeling of the film Becky when I was watching this as well. Satanic Panic, Black Christmas. And as I was watching this film, I noted to my wife, I said, this is why I don't like people who are really into Christmas, because that scene where they come to the killer, he's playing Christmas music. And I was just like, I'm already unsettled by who this guy is, but I'm even more unsettled by the Christmas music that's playing in the background.
It's weird that you do a podcast with somebody that loves Christmas so much.
No. No, there's a difference between loving Christmas and, being a Christmas person. It's just like people who complain about, I don't like Disney adults. I'm like, okay, everybody has their thing. So anyway, and the last film I would recommend, and this is not horror, this is documentary. It's not a horror or comedy or horror comedy. It's a documentary. I've mentioned it before on the show, and it's The Masks We Live In, which talks about masculinity and healthy masculinity, toxic masculinity, and the way that men are, at least in U.S. society, are conditioned to behave poorly. In a lot of cases, you're emotionally stunted because of this expectation of the way masculinity should be represented in a number of ways.
I'm definitely going to check that out. Yeah, I'm fascinated by that subject matter. I did not know that movie existed, so I'm definitely going to seek it out.
It's outstanding because you have men from all different walks of life, or you have masculinity addressed from all walks of life. Former football players, military personnel and veterans, police officers, teachers, cowboys, I think they bring in, and they bring in film. So they start analyzing all these things and actually deal with people who are deconstructing their own sense of what masculinity is or how it was taught to them, and deconstruct it to create masculinity in their own right and according to their own terms. And as simple of things as telling young boys that it's okay to cry, it's okay to have emotions, and this whole idea that emotions are a feminine quality or feminine trait is false and it's flawed. Where in this film, John could have definitely benefited from more interaction, more healthy emotional output or outpouring, and would have probably helped with the relationships that he had, with his daughter, with his ex-wife, with his father, with his coworkers, as opposed to what we've all talked about here, which is sometimes violent outbursts, sometimes profanity-laced outbursts, or threatening people with their jobs.
Yeah, I mean, as long as we're talking about deconstructing toxic masculinity, I want to give a shout out to, I'm on episode 6 of season 2 of Ted Lasso right now, which is a fantastic show for doing that in a quiet but very effective way.
Nice. I haven't gotten to watch it yet, but I keep hearing very good things.
Yes,
I haven't heard one bad thing said about that show yet.
Yeah, I don't think I have either.
It's fantastic. I think it's only because it's on Apple TV that there aren't huge numbers of people watching it, just because that's not as big a platform as many of the other ones.
Right.
All right, man, let's bring it back to you. Tell our listeners where they can find your stuff and anything else you want to say.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned before, I've written, I lose track now, 4 or 5 books, I think. If you look up Chris Vanderkay on Amazon, they'll all come up there. But I've written 3 or 4 nonfiction books on the history and philosophy of horror and science fiction. And, that one that I mentioned earlier, which is a sort of an infographic style satire book. You can find all that on Amazon. If you're looking to follow me, you head over to Twitter. I think that's pretty much the only social media I'm on. And it's at CK Vanderkay. And Vanderkay is spelled VANDERK, 2 A's and a Y, just to make it difficult for you. But yeah, that's pretty much that's the only social media I haunt anymore.
It's a good one to be on as a writer. So, all right. I guess that wraps it up for this week. So, as always, I am James Sabata.
And I am still Don Guillory. I haven't transformed despite the full moon this past week.
And we will see you next week here at thenecronama.com.